Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Business Rates and Lease Advisory webinar. So this is going to be a slightly updated version of the webinar that we delivered in November of last year. So hopefully you'll find it very useful. So some quick introductions. My name is Jordan Kennedy and I am the Head of Business Rates Consultancy at Vickery Holman. And I'm joined by my colleague, Amy Durkin, who is the Head of Lease Advisory. Amy and I are both chartered senior surveyors. Amy has been with Vickery Holman for 4 years, and I have been with the company for just over 3 years. Between us and our teams, we cover Truro, Plymouth, Exeter, and Bristol, and the many areas in between and beyond. So before we start with what we're going to be talking to you about today, we would just like to take a moment to remind you of the other services Vickery Holman have to offer, in addition to business rates consultancy and lease advisory. So as you can see here, we have building surveying, agency, property management, valuation, and development services departments. And we also offer dispute resolution services across these specialisms. So what do we have in store for you today? Amy is going to be taking you through 3 case studies, each focusing on a different aspect of lease advisory work. So we're going to have a rent review at a restaurant, a lease renewal at an industrial unit, and a lease surrender at an office premises. And alongside this, I'm going to be giving you an overview of how the rateable value of these different property types is calculated by the Valuation Office Agency. And I will be offering a commentary on these sectors in light of the recent publication of the draft 2023 rating list. I will also be advising you on how you might look to appeal the rateable value of these different property types should you suspect that they are too high. And finally, Amy is also going to provide you with an update on the minimum energy efficiency standards. So moving on to the 2023 business rates revaluation. As I've just mentioned, the draft 2023 rating list was published in November of last year. So owners and occupiers of commercial property can therefore now search their property by postcode and look at what the change is going to be to their rateable value from the 1st of April 2023. I've just got some figures for you here on more of a general overview of how the rateable values in the main commercial property sectors are going to change. So on this slide here, this is some figures on how we're going to be changing nationally. So as you can see, industrial rateable values are set to increase by 27.1%. Office rateable values are going to increase by 10.2%. And welcome news, retail rateable values are going to be decreasing by an average of 10%. And those properties which fall into the category of other are going to be seeing an increase of 4.2% overall. And moving on to the Southwest more specifically, it's largely mirrored in the Southwest, so almost exactly mirrored by industrial properties, which are going to be increasing by 27%. Office rateable values are going to be increasing by 14%, and retail rateable values are looking to decrease by 4.7%. And again, those properties which fall into the category of other are going to see an increase of 5.9% overall. So as you can see, unfortunately, the increases in the Southwest are actually slightly higher than the national average, or meeting them in the case of industrial, and the decreases are unfortunately slightly lower. So I just thought it might be helpful to give an example of how this might affect an occupier in real terms. So for example, if you are occupying an industrial unit, which in the 2017 rating list has a rateable value of 40,000, the rateable value from the 1st of April this year could increase to around 50,800. And this would mean an actual business rates liability increase from 19,960 per annum to 25,350. However, the government has introduced some measures to support businesses through this. So as you can see on this slide here, the business rates multiplier has been frozen for another year to protect businesses from rising inflation. So if you have a rateable value of under 51,000, your multiplier is 49.9 pence in the pound. and above 51,000 rateable value, it is 51.2 pence in the pound, and that will remain the same throughout 2023, 2024, so until the end of March 2024. Those in the retail, hospitality and leisure sectors will benefit from an extension to the Retail, Hospitality and Leisure Relief Scheme. So those properties will enjoy, if occupied, an increase from 50% relief this year to 75% relief from 2023 to 2024. There is yet to be any comment from the government on what may happen beyond those dates. Thirdly, and importantly, for those seeing an increase in rateable value, transitional relief will be reformed. So there are caps if your rateable value and your business rates liability are increasing by over a certain amount, so that they are gradually fed in throughout the 3-year list. And if your rateable value is decreasing, the downward cap has been removed, so you will enjoy the benefit of the decrease in your rateable value straight away, which did not used to be the case. And finally, the government has introduced a supporting small business scheme worth over £500 million, which supports those who will be losing small business rates relief as a result of the revaluation. So those people's bills should not go up by more than £600 in the first year. So not all bad news, but there are definitely some things to be looked at here, which we will discuss a little bit further later on. And now I'm going to pass you over to Amy, who's going to start off with a word about the minimum energy efficiency standards. Amy.
Thank you, Jordan, and good morning, everybody. I'm going to start with an issue that has been spoken about for years and in various stages has come into the foreground, but now we're probably April this year coming up something that potentially does mean an awful lot for a lot of commercial properties. So from April this year, it will be unlawful to continue to let a commercial property with an EPC of below E unless the landlord registers an exemption. Currently, there's various exemptions in place, usually surrounding the argument that the works required to do to bring the property up to standard would be substantially more than would be reasonable, and therefore an exemption can be lodged. The requirements like this have been in place for new lettings and lease renewals for a number of years, but this does not seem to be a barrier to agreeing new terms. And I've been working on lease renewals where there is property with a lower banding. It hasn't particularly been of a concern to either party just yet. But it's worth noting, as this requirement now becomes live for every commercial property, we expect the matter of having valid EPC certificates at the right rating to be more of a consideration when agreeing new terms, and also when getting leases signed and in place. Watch this space with this, and it'll be interesting to see. And we know that the band level is going to increase the minimum band in various years' time. So it's big pressure on a lot of commercial properties where their ratings are on the lower side of things. Okay, let's look at our first case study then this morning, which is a restaurant premises, typical restaurant premises in Exeter. Let's say the rent is £40,000. There's going to be a rent review due here this month rather, and the key here is to work out is key here to work out what will be the next steps. So the first thing to establish is how the rent is going to be calculated. And there's usually two ways of doing this. It is the RPI or CPI linked or index linked rent review, or a market rent review. An RPI or CPI linked rent review is quite easy to work out because it just involves looking at the appropriate figures listed on the Office for National Statistics for the lease start date and also the review date, and applying this to the current rent. And until recently, these sorts of reviews were thought of as achieving smaller increases than market rents in many cases. However, this figure has risen this year with the increase of inflation. So it's actually probably less advantageous for a tenant now to have a rent that is linked to these figures. With a market rent review, it's usually upward only. although there is a case and there are tenants arguing for a rent review to be either upward or downward, there's an argument this is more accurate, reflects the market rent better. It's just for landlords, this would be a little bit of a shock, having had upward only for so long, to then potentially be at risk of rent coming down. The other thing to look at with a rent review is the assumptions and disregards that are thought of when you're going through the calculation. The usual assumptions to make, which are all listed out in a typical lease, is that the property is vacant and suitable for immediate occupation. The hypothetical term is usually defined in the lease, and that is often 10 years duration or the unexpired residue of the term, whichever is longer. There's usually disregards for improvements made by the tenant, and this can be an area of contention, most commonly with a mezzanine floor in an industrial property, say, whether the landlord is able to rentalise that. And also a rent-free period. So rent-free periods that are normal in the market are to be disregarded. That's usually for a 3-month period for fitting out for tenants, say. But rent-free used as an incentive to get a tenant in is generally not regarded, as this represents a reduction in the rent, the average rent over the lease term. So it's essentially saying that the rent is actually a bit lower than the headline level. So we go through the rent review process with some negotiation, looking at comparable evidence. And if no agreement can be sought, there is a way forward with it through third-party determination. And again, the lease, 9 times out of 10, will specify what is required, with 2 options there to use either an independent expert or an arbitrator. The cost of going through third-party determination can be quite vast, and a lot of cases are easily negotiated without this process. However, if there is a large gap in valuation of both parties, or they differ in approach a lot, then this third-party determination is a way forward to a decision. The process usually takes a few months, so it's quicker than most lease renewals, but it can be delayed if one party is hesitant. On to Jordan.
Thanks, Amy. So, as I mentioned in the introduction, I am going to discuss the rateable values of each of our different property types in the context of the recent publication of the draft 2023 rating list. So to give that a bit of context, as you may already be aware, the Valuation Office Agency, or VOA for short, estimate the open market rental value of a property on what is known as an antecedent valuation date. This estimate of the open market rental value of the property then becomes known as the property's rateable value. And this figure is then multiplied at a rate which is determined by the government, and this produces the annual business rates liability. So that's the 49.9 pence and 51.2 pence currently that I mentioned a little earlier on. And rateable values are then updated periodically to bring business rates liabilities in line with market conditions. And that's the 2023 revaluation that I've been mentioning is the first revaluation we've had in 6 years. And that's why, as of the 1st of April 2023, all businesses will have a new rateable value, in theory, more in line with recent market conditions, as these values are based on a valuation date of the 1st of April 2021. So coming back to our example of a restaurant, I'll now take you through how the rateable value of a restaurant is calculated, and then give you a bit of information on how this can be appealed. So most high street restaurants, like in our example, are valued by the Valuation Office on a price per square metre basis. And units located on high streets are usually measured in terms of Zone A, which is a method of applying a unit of rent to the zones of the area of the unit for rental valuation purposes. And this follows the principle that the most valuable area of the high street shop or restaurant is to be found at the front. So, you know, more often the display area, the area closest to the windows. And then the value of that unit then declines with the increasing depth of the unit. So this is why we use the terminology measured in terms of zone A, as we then divide the shop into zones of equal depth, and with the value of the first zone being, say, for example, £300 a square metre, and then each successive zone towards the rear of the unit is halved back in value. So in this example, zone B would be £150 a square metre, zone C 75, and so forth. And the rate per square metre itself is based upon local rental evidence at the valuation date. So therefore, a key way of checking the accuracy of the rateable value of a restaurant is therefore, first of all, to have a professional measure the premises in full to ensure the floor area that the VOA are using to calculate the rateable value is correct. And in cases of high street premises, it can be particularly important to check that the zone A area has been considered correctly, as this is where most of the value of that unit is held. Having confirmed the floor areas, the professional advisor would then carry out comparable evidence research to ensure that the rate per square metre used in the valuation appears fair. Of course, not all restaurants are on high streets, so I'll just quickly talk you through how more unique restaurants are valued, or those that occupy rural locations, and indeed pubs. These are all calculated using a different method, which is the receipts and expenditure method of valuation. In this, the fair maintainable turnover of the premises at the valuation date is established, and this is based on the actual turnover figures of that premises and those in the surrounding area. And then a percentage is applied to this figure, which reflects the quality and location and the offering of that property. And this then produces the rateable value. It can be possible to either check or challenge the fair maintainable turnover that the valuation office have selected on premises of this nature. We've often found that simply a mistake has been made, and if it doesn't reflect the actual turnover of the premises, an appeal can be made to the valuation office to have this reduced. And also the percentages applied can be often argued down, depending on the specific location of that premises. So it's definitely always worth having at least an initial discussion to see if there's anything that can be done on that for you. And just to take it back to our example of Exeter, finally, the draft rating list indicates at the moment that restaurant rateable values in Exeter itself are going to be increasing by about 3.6% between the 2017 and the 2023 rating list. I'll now hand you back over to Amy for our industrial example.
Thank you, Jordan. Case study 2, we're looking to Bodmin now, down in Cornwall, and an industrial premises, rent of £35,000 per annum, and a rateable value of 20,000, which will be significant when Jordan speaks in a bit. So here we have a lease renewal, the expiry being the end of May, and the landlord and the tenant wish to have a new tenancy. So first of all, a review of the rent and suitable lease terms should be done. So when looking at comparable evidence, this renewal is 4 months in advance from now. So ideally we need to look at the most modern transactions. Rent is on the increase generally in industrial properties. So there is a danger when looking at older evidence that applying that to this property may result in a under market rent potentially, if we're looking from the landlord's point of view. Properties that are similar size and condition to are ideal, and often with industrial, properties are often on an estate, and so buildings in the same estate are ideal, the best place to start with. Looking at this lease renewal, it will be inside the 1954 Act. So the various notices, Section 25 or Section 26 notices, are valid here to be used. So the Section 25 notice is from the landlord to the tenant, and the Section 26 is from the tenant to the landlord, and each essentially brings the tenancy to a close and offers new terms for a new tenancy in this case. They give a maximum of 12 months and a minimum of 6 months notice that the tenancy is ending. So if we served one of these notices today, the expiry date for this lease would then move to the end of July. So the tenant is potentially going to have a few more months of paying a lower than market rent if we assume that the rent for this property is going to go up. There are mechanisms for recovering this in the lease renewal process, but they are quite lengthy, complicated, and I think my message with this example is with a lease renewal, the best thing to do is to have a record of when properties are coming up for renewal nice and early, so that a surveyor can take a look at the rents and provide you with potential new terms for the property as soon as possible, so that this notice can be served on time, perhaps with the exact 6 months before the end of the tenancy. Okay, back to Jordan.
Thank you. Yes, so as Amy mentioned, the RV rateable value on this premises is a little bit lower than the rent. And this is because the current rateable values are based on rents at the valuation date in April 2015. So, of course, this looks set to change as the revaluation brings rateable values more in line with the rising industrial market. So, as previously mentioned, the rateable values in the southwest of industrial units are going to be increasing overall by 27%. And in Bodmin, more specifically, this increase is going to amount to about 16%. So in the case of our example, in real terms, that will be an increase of about £1,500 a year in business rates liability. But there are things that can be done potentially to either bring this down or at least ensure that the rateable value is correct and your business rates are fair. So again, industrial premises are valued on a price per square metre basis, and the valuation office agency assess the rental value of the property, assuming a hypothetical tenancy, which is based on 7 assumptions. So these assumptions are that the property is vacant, that it is available to let on an annual tenancy on full repairing and insuring terms. It's assumed that the property is in good repair and that the tenant will be paying the rates, and that the property will remain in its current use and that no or only very minor alterations will be made. The valuation office agency also place properties in a valuation scheme, and this valuation scheme reflects the location, quality and age of the property amongst other factors. I'm mentioning this for industrial units, but that applies to all property types. They are all placed within a valuation scheme, and then the value of that property is placed somewhere within that valuation scheme by the valuation office. So again, a key way of checking the accuracy of industrial rateable values is to have a professional measure the premises in full to ensure the area the VOA are using to calculate the rateable value is correct. And then having confirmed that the floor areas are correct, we would then carry out comparable evidence research to ensure the rate per square metre used in the valuation appears fair. And then on top of that, we would check that the property has been placed in an appropriate valuation scheme and that the rate per square metre placed on that property looks fair within that valuation scheme. Also with industrial property, plant and machinery can attract value, and it can therefore be important to ensure that only the plant and machinery at the premises is actually included in your summary valuation. Thank you. I'll pass back over to Amy for our final example of an office.
Thank you. Yes, last example onto the office sector. A large multi-floor building in Bristol with quite a substantial rent, £120,000 per annum. In this situation, we're going to look at a lease surrender. Let's say that the tenant's break option has passed and they have another 2 years until lease expiry. Tenant wishes to downsize fairly quickly, so they are looking at a surrender of the lease. This is essentially a negotiation between the landlord and the tenant to agree what kind of premium, if any, should be paid to the landlord if the tenant was just to leave relatively soon, before the end of the lease. There needs to be a balance between the loss of rental income and the outgoings that the landlord would be responsible for if the property was empty. So this would be business rates minus any empty property relief, utilities, building insurance, etc. And this will be balanced with looking at the current market for the property, how long before the property could be relet. There's some cases where there would be no premium being paid and the tenant would essentially leave when they needed to. Looking at industrial units again, this could be realistic because the landlord's agent would be able to relet the property within a matter of months, and therefore there wouldn't be a great deal of outgoings for the landlord in that time. Another would be if the landlord wishes to sell the property or look at redevelopment options. The fact that the tenant is leaving in some cases would not be a bad thing, and they might consider surrender without a massive premium. In this case, with this large office unit, it's very large and a very big rent. I would expect some sort of premium to be paid by the tenant in order to make an early exit.
Thank you, Amy. Yes, so I'm going to speak slightly differently on this property as it's going to be vacant, but just worth noting that the draft rating list has indicated that office rateable values in Bristol specifically are going to increase by around 20% between the 2017 rating list and the 2023 rating list. So office rateable values, again, are calculated in much the same way as industrial properties and retail high street properties on a price per square metre basis. Again, informed by a range of values within an appropriate valuation scheme. However, in this case, as the property is due to become vacant, this will see the business rates liability return to the landlord. We would still advise the landlord, firstly, to have a professional review of the business rates assessment carried out, as we have already discussed, to ensure that the floor areas and valuation itself seem fair. But another consideration here is that when a property becomes empty property relief applies for 3 months or 6 months in the case of industrial units. And after this time, full rates will then become payable by the occupier, which in the case of a vacant property is the landlord or property owner. So if, as in this example, a landlord does find themselves with an empty unit, after the 3-month exemption period, they would become liable to pay the business rates liability in full. We do offer a solution to this, though, which can be implemented indefinitely until such time as the property can be reoccupied. And this allows the liable occupier to enjoy additional period of empty rates relief by resetting the clock on that relief using temporary occupation. Alternatively, finding themselves with a vacant property, the landlord might, of course, decide to redevelop the property. For example, a change of use from office to residential, or a reconfiguration of the property to make it more appealing to future occupiers. So where a property is undergoing significant redevelopment or refurbishment, it may be possible to have it temporarily removed from the rating list whilst works are ongoing. We would have advised this landlord if the planned works would constitute the type of works required to remove the property from the rating list. And if so, we would submit a detailed check to the valuation office on the landlord's behalf with supporting evidence to achieve the best possible savings over the appropriate length of time whilst those works were ongoing. And finally, a property of this nature may indeed in the end be subdivided into smaller units to make it more attractive to potential occupiers or to make it easier to relet. In this case, we can assist with liaising with the valuation office agency to split the property into new hereditaments or new business rates assessments when the individual units are let. And in turn, we can also apply to the local authority on landlord's behalf for relief under Section 44A of the Local Government Finance Act. So finding yourself with a vacant property, there are still plenty of options to consider regarding business rates mitigation whilst that property is vacant. And then when it's reoccupied, looking at dividing the property up appropriately to ensure all occupiers are only paying what they should. So that's all from me on business rates, unless, of course, you have any questions at the end. I hope the point that I have conveyed is that rateable values can and should be checked for accuracy. With the 2017 rating list shortly coming to an end, this is a really key time to look at this, as the process of challenging the current list must be started and logged with the Valuation Office by the 31st of March this year. And any savings that are discovered can be backdated as far as the 1st of April 2017. But if the 31st of March deadline is missed, some of those savings, if they do apply to your property, might be missed as well. Also, as the draft 2023 rating list has been published, if there are any factual errors in the property details held on that list, they can already at this time be corrected. So if there are any errors there and they're corrected now, that could have an impact on your future rateable value and bring it down to ensure that it's based only on the correct property facts. Challenges to the actual rates per square metre in future valuations can't be logged until the 1st of April, but we can certainly be preparing arguments for those in the meantime. So great time to have rateable values looked at, as there's a lot that can be done at this juncture. And we're always happy to answer any questions, so please do give Amy, myself, or the rest of the team a call, and we'll go through your options with you. Thank you.
So yeah, that's it from us in terms of content here. With questions, if you could put them in the chat for a few minutes, we'll do our best to answer them. There's also some polls on the system there as well that you can have your say on. There's a question here from Paul. Hi, Paul. About RPI rent reviews, and the landlord would be looking to apply an increase upon the rent review due now. Would this be justified on the basis that inflation is due to significantly decrease? And what should the tenant position be? That is interesting. My thought there is that the rent review in the lease will usually specify what dates will be used both as the base rate and the current rate, and as that's usually the base rate is the start of the lease, the month that the lease started in, and the current date will be usually it's 2 months before or after the rent review date, but it usually specifies in the lease. And so I think technically you would have to stick to what it says in the lease and use the figures that pop up in those particular months. So right now that would probably produce quite an increase, and potentially by the end of the year it wouldn't. Possibly you might be able to agree between landlord and tenant to cap the figure. Quite often we'll have a collar and cap clause on something that doesn't allow the rent to increase by the actual amount if something like this could happen. I think that might be an idea going forward, where inflation has recently been pretty standard levels, but it's now moving up and down quite quickly. That's something that can be looked at. If it's not in a current lease, possibly just finding an agreement between the landlord and tenant and having it in writing might be enough to satisfy that. Just bear in mind, normally with rent reviews, there is no time limit either to deal with them. So a landlord can trigger a rent review that's quite a few years past and demand the back rent from that as well. Not always. Sometimes in the lease it will specify there is a specific time to deal with it, and once that time's gone, you can't do it. But I would say probably 98-9% of leases don't have that in there. So if there is an agreement made between landlord and tenant on that, it would have to be very clear that prevents, say, the landlord from looking at it later on and trying to renegotiate the figures or reapply the figures. So yeah, an interesting one. Probably agreeing a cap and collar on to restrict the increase or decrease, in fact, would be the option going forward, I would say. But thank you. What else have we got?
There's a couple of rating and another one for you, but I'll grab the rating ones. Robert, thank you for your question. In short, yes, there is, but I don't have the actual facts off the top of my head, but I have taken a note of your email address and I will come back to you in that on full. That's the question: is there an allowance for sustainable investments? So yes, I thank you for that. I will come back to that in more detail. And Helen, really interesting question: is the relief to a landlord for different properties likely to change now that demand for different sectors has now changed? Personally, yes, I definitely agree with your point. We very rarely see an industrial unit vacant for 6 months, and indeed often see retail premises vacant for much longer than 3 months. But as far as I am aware, right now there are no plans to change the empty property relief regulations. But yes, certainly agreed that that's something that perhaps might be looked at in the future, as the market has most definitely changed. I think, Amy, there's a couple for you as well.
Giles, here one on break options. Aware of the preconditions for tenants, what are preconditions for a landlord? So that would be, I imagine, if you've got some landlord and tenant break, because usually most break clauses are tenant only, but say there is a option where the landlord can determine the lease. As usual with leases, landlords don't have that many obligations compared to a tenant. They will often need to give slightly longer notice periods potentially than a tenant, because a tenant has a lot more at stake from having to leave potentially only in 3 months. So I would say they probably need to give 12 or 6 months notice if they wanted to take back the property. There may also be terms along the lines of where it says the tenant has to pay all their rent and have all their follow all the lines of the lease. Again, the landlord probably will have to stick with their requirements of the lease to ensure the property, to give the tenant quiet enjoyment, that sort of thing. So I would imagine that would be what your conditions for a landlord would be, but it's not as many as for tenant generally. Thank you. And one at the bottom here, Samuel, a COVID question. Good. How would you say that COVID has affected rent review negotiations, especially with restaurants, pubs, gyms, and leisure? I would say with restaurants, it's fairly one way or the other. There are some restaurants that are now really back to full capacity, have taken all the sort of loans and finance options available during COVID and are now doing quite well. That being said, obviously that was a big shock to the market there. I think it really depends on the location for these properties, and if they're already in very successful locations in terms of agreeing new rent and lease terms, probably not a lot would change. I have seen some clients or tenants looking at putting in a COVID clause or a pandemic clause specifically into their leases, which allow them to break a lease, usually at any point in this, if there was another pandemic, or give them the option to not pay rent for a certain length of time. So I have seen those. And again, landlords, that's a mixture of landlords that are happy enough with that, thinking, the first pandemic was a fairly unlikely thing to happen. Will it happen again? There are some landlords that are very anti this. And so that's an issue there that is being negotiated and talked about through solicitors. With gyms and large leisure, again, I haven't seen a massive difference in how we look at rent review there, because rent reviews are usually in the middle of a lease, and the terms may well have been agreed before COVID. It's limited what either party can kind of try and change the assumptions and the disregards that are followed when you're looking at a rent review. So overall not, but then again, these things are fairly long term, and we get several years down the line and can really see what a difference that nearly 3 years past the start of it has made. Then maybe so, and the rent review clauses that are being written up in current leases and future leases may well make reference to that and what could potentially be done if a rent review hits in another period like that. Thank you, Samuel. Okay. Should we look at the polls, Jordan, briefly before we finish? There's
Yes.
two there, both on rates. Have you checked your business rates recently?
That's interesting. I would.
Or a mixture there.
Yeah. I think the not sure if it applies to me or my business, I would say to those people, please do give us a call if you'd like to talk that through, as it very well could apply. Of course, there are exemptions out there, or if you are benefiting from small business rates relief at the moment, it may not apply. If you're getting 100% small business rates relief, but there's a chance that could change with rateable values going up in some sectors, as discussed. So yes, potentially worth having a conversation if ever you're not sure. And those whose to-do list it is on, hopefully some of the dates that we've talked about have helped you see that it might be worth doing something slightly sooner rather than later. Certainly if you've been occupying a property from the very beginning of this rating list in April 2017. And the second poll, are you aware of the new business rates list? I hope that those that aren't sure what it is are now slightly more aware of what it is and how it might affect you. And yes, again, there's a few that are aware that haven't looked at it yet. So if you do go on to search on your browser, find my business rates valuation, and you pop in your postcode, you should be able to find your current and future rateable value there quite easily, and see if you're going to be experiencing an increase, decrease, or staying the same.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think the overriding thing is if you occupy any commercial property or bits of residential that can be potentially moved into rating, it's always worth being aware of it, and to let us know if there are any issues there, because we deal with every kind of area of business rates and council tax as well for certain kinds of property. So yeah, please do give us a call. Just a note on LinkedIn there on the screen. We're quite an active company on LinkedIn, and we'd like to see what you thought of our webinar and what else perhaps you would like in the future, or any comments at all. If you wanted to post something for LinkedIn, we'd be very grateful. And those are some typical hashtags that we use there for our posts. So we'll be posting about this shortly, and we'd love to see what else pops up when we have a look. Final notice, there are some handouts on the handout section here, which will be available for a couple more minutes. One for lease advisory, one for the business rates evaluation. These are the latest flyers we have that detail the key members of staff and all the services that we can provide for you. So most of the audience, I can see, have downloaded the flyers there. So I think we are able to call it to a close. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody. And thank you, Jordan. And we hope to see you soon at another webinar, either through the whole of VH or one of our own. We'll certainly be keeping everyone up to date with the latest in these two topics. So thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.